This is what you can do about taking control of your own health, a podcast for people interested in learning how to create bodies that are healthy, strong, fit, and disease resistant. I'm Sean McClendon, your host. I'm a certified personal trainer, an author, and a health and fitness enthusiast. Thank you for joining me today. My featured book for this episode is my book titled 8 Weeks to Transform Your Diet and Your Health. You can have the best exercise routine in the world, but if your diet is off, one thing is guaranteed: you will not see results. In 8 weeks to transform your diet and your health, I've created an easy to follow set of eating habits for you to adopt over 8 weeks to boost your health, most importantly, promote fat loss, and get the most out of your exercise regimen. When you finish this fat loss workbook, you will finally know how to eat to get results. Make sure you look in the description below to get your copy of 8 Weeks to Transform Your Diet and Your Health. I've recently updated that book within the past year. Much needed updates after, acquiring of knowledge and better understanding. So yeah, it's updated recently. Make sure you get your copy. The information on this podcast is based on my personal research and opinion, and is not meant to be a substitute for advice from a doctor or physician. You are advised to consult your doctor or physician before making any changes to your lifestyle. All right, so in this episode of the podcast, I want to talk about a study that I came across that talks about the diet and, I guess, essentially body size of a group of people in Africa, in Tanzania, called the Hadza people, and they live traditionally. What I mean is they live a more hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle, meaning that they hunt for their meat and they gather. They don't do agriculture, at least a portion of them still don't, but they gather, different types of foods, plant foods and things like that. And so this group is thought to be one of the last groups, if not the last group on the face of the earth, that still actually lives this way. Now, the reason why I want to talk about this study is because it's kind of related to a recent podcast, probably a couple of recent podcasts that I've done, namely one of them being the one where I talked about eating 3 meals a day. But just this whole question of, are we kind of off in the way that we eat? I mean, we know that we eat a lot of processed foods and whatnot, and that those pretty much under no circumstances are healthy. Like I said, for the most part. Pardon me. But anyway, whenever you compare how we live to a group of people who are relatively unaffected by modern day living, by industrialization, and even modern day agriculture, I thought it'd be good to kind of like really think about and look at this study. I've put a link to this study in the show notes below this podcast, so make sure that you check those out. So here are some of the key points that I pulled from this study. Now, I believe you'll find this very interesting. If you are a person who is seeking to learn about the effect of society on your health and the things that you don't necessarily think about intuitively anymore, not because they're unimportant, but because we were taught not to think this way. I think in our modern day society, sometimes we kind of think that we know better than other groups of people who are not as technologically developed and whatnot. But there's a reason why a lot of them have low or zero existence of heart disease, cancer, type 2 diabetes, and so many of the other diseases that plague the West, United States, and Europe. So anyhow, check out these notes that I gathered from the study, and then I'm going to share some of my thoughts. So the Hadza, like I said, they're hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, which is, I believe, West Africa, I believe it is. I should look at my globe in there, but I didn't. But I'm pretty sure it is. But they're thought to be the last full-time hunter-gatherer population, meaning that they totally subsist off of hunting and gathering. So the study actually investigated whether or not they expended more energy than the typical the typical Westerner. Did they burn more calories? And the thought, I think what they expected to find is that indeed they did burn more calories because they're out hunting and all this stuff all the time. Whereas, we're not doing that for sure. So check this out. What the study found was that physical activity in the group was indeed higher, but the average daily energy expenditure was roughly the same when taking body size into account. So let me read that again. Physical activity amongst the Hadza people was indeed higher, but the average daily energy expenditure, was roughly the same when taking body size into account. So in other words, it'll make more sense later. Just stay with me. So I won't go into that now. So other findings, the Hadza are highly active people, like I said, and lean. Their body fat was the range that they gave. And by the way, this study was from 2012. It was published in 2012. But the range of body fat was 13.5% plus or minus 4.2 percentage points. So that means about average of between about 9% body fat and about 17% body fat. Whereas on the same table in this study, they had the body fat range for Western people. I should say men. This is body fat for men. For Western men is 22.5% plus or minus 5%. So you got a range of body fat for Hadza men between about 9 and 17% on average. But for Western men between about 17 and 27% on average. So anyway, I'm gonna get ahead of. I was about to get ahead of myself, but let me wait. Another thing that the study noted was that the bodies, like the actual body size of the Hadza people, was significantly smaller than the body size of an average Western person. Important to note with the other detail that I pulled out of the study that I read earlier that said that the average daily expenditure was roughly the same between Hadza people and Western people when taking the body size into account. So the body size, so in other words, again, let me just wait. Just stay for some of the interpretation. Well, I'll just go ahead and explain that. So basically, the Hadza people being more physically active are also smaller people, but like that activity level was apparently related to the body size. So the smaller, the more active. So when they took that into account, then it essentially suggested that the average daily expenditure of calories between Western people and Hadza people is about the same. An interesting way to look at it, I thought, and I got this quote from the study. The study suggested that, quote, differences in obesity prevalence between populations result primarily from differences in energy intake rather than expenditure. So the differences in obesity prevalence, how often you see obesity in the population, results primarily from differences in energy intake. In other words, what they take in, what they eat, rather than expenditure. So in other words, what they're saying is obesity seemed a lot more, seemed primarily due to how people eat, the differences in how people eat, rather than in how they expend energy. And in other words, also saying something that I mentioned in a podcast relatively recently, which is that your diet is a lot more important than exercise when it comes to losing weight, preventing overweight and obesity. All right, so I thought about that study a bit and just kind of was thinking through my own thoughts about this. So like I said, the total energy, what they call the average daily energy expenditure, but they also call it total energy expenditure. It was adjusted for body size. So again, the Hadza people were smaller and more active, but with body size taken into account, with us being Western people being larger, it was somehow comparable. I kind of found that a little bit interesting and even kind of hard to believe. I say I found it more of an interesting way to study this, because my whole thing is, why is it that they are smaller on average? Is it because they are more active? You see what I'm saying? So I may be missing something there. But I thought that was an interesting way to look at this. Is it their genetics? Obviously, it's a group of African people. Those of us who are, African American may, of course, be more closely related. But there's so much stuff in there that could make that different. I just find that an interesting way to. I find it interesting to compare body size and activity level. But anyhow, like I noted before, the bottom range of body fat average for Western men, about 17%, was essentially like the higher average range of body fat for Hadza men, about 17%. Very interesting. So again, their average high body fat range, body fat was about 17%. That was about our lowest. So these folks, with an average range from 9 to 17%, that's very lean. So I've once gotten my body fat to about 10%. It was like about 10.5%. And I was relatively lean. And that was kind of a challenge, at least by the way I did it back then. That was kind of a challenge, by the way. But that was, a reasonably often seen body fat percentage amongst the Hadza people. Very, very interesting. Very different body fat levels. And we know that excessive body fat levels are associated with, more hormone issues, more insulin resistance, diabetes, and so many other lifestyle caused diseases. Another question I had was, how does the body fat percentage relate to the activity level? So they compare body size to activity level. Remember, body size, that takes into account all of your weight, not just your body fat. But I wonder how the body fat percentage relates to the activity levels. Because I would think that the lower the body fat, the higher activity would be associated with that. Okay, so now let's get into some of the stuff that you might be more interested in. So if their study suggested that differences in obesity prevalence between Hadza and Western populations is more so associated with energy intake rather than energy expenditure, the question is, how do the Hadza people eat? So again, they're hunter-gatherers, which means basically they eat whatever they can pick up, whatever they can hunt. So their diets are totally natural. At least those who are still doing total hunting and gathering. And they're based on, like I said, what they can hunt and forage. When I say hunt, that's meat, all kinds of meat, porcupines, deer, was it the capybara, I think is one of the ones I saw, baboon meat, and so on and so forth, birds. And then as far as foraging, they forage a lot of tubers, berries, seeds, leafy vegetables, and honey. That was something that was interesting too. They actually consume a whole lot of honey. And they hunt and forage every single day. Now, we don't eat anything like that. Our diets, as you know, on average consist of what we call the standard American diet. Very high in processed packaged foods, which have a variety of chemicals. A lot of times they're grain-based, highly refined grains at that. Sugar, a lot of sugar, a lot of salt, colorings, this, that, and the other, all of which can do a number on the body, jack up your blood sugar, increase insulin resistance, and so on and so forth. and we don't hunt and forage for anything. I mean, if you're from the South or some other areas in this country, you know, you probably hunt during hunting season a bit, but it's still different. Okay. The Hadza people eat more meat during dry season. It's basically two seasons there: dry season, and wet season. Dry season apparently is easier to find meat because the meat is, you know, the animals who they hunt are, you know, kind of more usually located around watering holes around that time because the water is harder to find. So it's easier to find the meat. But then in the wet season, it's harder to find meat. So the diet shifts more so toward berries, tubers, and honey. So they have, during the wet season, their meat consumption appears to go like way down. They don't eat meat necessarily all the time. Actually, they seem to eat meat pretty rarely. All right, so let's stop here and just kind of think about this. So they have a diet that causes them to, they have to go out and get it every single day. And I'm not talking about go to the grocery store. I'm talking about go on foot and get whatever they're going to eat every single day. It's totally natural. It's unadulterated, not processed, fresh, all of that type of stuff. Doesn't really appear that they do a whole lot of grains. I'm not necessarily saying grains are bad, but as far as like nutritionally, a lot of people have a hard time digesting grains. And then also, grains are not necessarily the most nutritionally dense, but we tend to consume most of our calories from grains and starches and whatnot because of the recommendation, you know, decades ago to consume 6 to 11 servings of grains a day, which now we know that's not where it's at. So a lot of tubers, seeds, plants, nuts, honey, berries, is what they consume, and then they lean toward meat in the dry season. So a big difference between them and us is the fact that they don't consume the processed foods. They don't consume them. They don't usually consume any of the drinks that we consume, the concentrated, you know, sugar, any of that. And now one thing I wish I found out more about was what is their total caloric consumption. And I wasn't able to really find that. However, one thing I did find, I wish I could remember where I got the source from. Some dude who went and lived with them for a bit to kind of hunt with them and kind of eat the way that they ate and to kind of see the effect on his microbiome. And one thing that he saw, well, of course, in addition to his biome being more diverse, is that they didn't really seem to care much about dinner. So it seems like, I think they don't really do much of a dinner, you know, at least in the sense of how we think. And then also, I believe what I saw, they do eat breakfast. But that they also, on the hunt, they're you know, gathering berries along the way and whatnot. You know, a lot of times when they actually do hunt and find, the men typically hunt, the women typically forage. But when they find like a animal along the way, they may go ahead and eat the organs right then and there. So you kind of get the sense that they aren't necessarily eating a whole lot of big meals. You know, at least not until they kind of come together again and whatever. So I would love to find more information that kind of talks about how they eat. But it does appear that they don't necessarily do a whole lot of a dinner, which kind of implies a period of time where, you know, they're kind of akin to our intermittent fasting, that they're not eating until the next day. Not sure if they eat before they go on their foraging or hunting. One more thing to note on the topic of microbiome, if you've ever done research on microbiome, it's definitely very much associated with whether or not a person is obese. And the microbiome of the Hadza people is apparently very, very diverse because of the huge amount of fibrous plant foods that they consume. So they have a lot of different bacteria in their guts that we don't actually have. Apparently they eat more than 100 grams of fiber per day there versus like 15 grams per day on average compared to Westerners. An anthropologist who studied the people some decades ago said they appear to be always hungry but never starving. So what that implied to me is that they don't necessarily again have huge meals. They're not hungry. They're not going hungry by any means. And I think the anthropologist also was saying something to the effect of, while they couldn't really notice coming to study the people, they couldn't really notice the food that was available. It appeared that food was everywhere. And even the youngest of people, young 3-4-year-olds knew where to find the food and all that. So it was plenty of it, but they never were really stuffing themselves, but they were also never starving themselves either. So kind of keeping the hungry. That's something I mentioned some time ago, maybe a couple months ago, in a quote. Something I posted on social media, like that we don't need to be scared to be hungry. And that's something that we really need to understand, because we've been so conditioned to always need something feel like we need something in our stomach, but we can't be scared to be hungry anymore. So that was very interesting to hear what that anthropologist said, that they are always hungry, but never starving. Now, of course, the anthropologist said that I don't know if he really knew how they truly felt. So I don't know. So yeah, I just kind of wanted to highlight those things because I'm always interested in comparing, because we have so many detrimental effects of lifestyle here in our Western society that cause so many diseases and whatnot. I'm always interested in seeing what people whose stuff has been less adulterated over time, what are they doing? How is it they're not getting these different kind of diseases that we're getting? And again, in a nutshell, it seems like they don't have a lot of huge meals. They maybe don't necessarily eat toward the evening time. They're always hunting and gathering their food. It's always pure food. Doesn't necessarily seem like it's grains and stuff like that, and no processed food. They are more active, but according to the study, when compared to when taking body size into account, they're about as active as we are. But again, the main thing to me is that they're more active. And I have a feeling that if the average American went over and spent a lot of time with them, then they would have a smaller body size too, if you kind of see what I'm saying. Let me see, what else? What else did I want to reiterate? Meat is not necessarily year around. It's not as nearly as frequent. And they do a lot of honey, plant foods, tubers, which are like, underground, like potato-like things that they eat, seeds and stuff like that. Main thing, y'all, is we have to find a way to be more active. And we also have, naturally, I believe, and we also have to find a way we have to stop eating so many of these weird foods that we make here in Western society. Because it's just that body fat difference, 9 to 17% on the Hadza side, and then you got 17 to 27% on the American side or Western side. Come on, man, that's a whole lot more body fat. So we gotta understand. I think the main place that comes from is our highly starchy, highly sugary, highly processed diets where we also eat probably more frequently than we need to, especially associated with our how often we're moving and stuff like that. So anyhow, these are kind of the conclusions I came up with. If you want to do your own looking, I post my sources in the description. I'm always studying this stuff because it interests me a whole lot. On my own quest to be healthier, but also to perpetuate a healthier type of way of looking at things and offering a different perspective than what we typically have been educated to think here in Western society, because we obviously don't have it all right. If we did, then we wouldn't have all these high levels of preventable diseases in a country that spends more on healthcare than the size of a whole lot of other countries' GDP. So yeah, that's that. That's that. Look at the sources, do your own research, and become healthier as a result. You know, because you have to learn what it really means to be healthy, not necessarily take the word of everybody else, because after all, it is your body. You're the one who's responsible for it, like I always say. All right, make sure you get your copy of my book down in the description. Make sure you subscribe, like, share, comment. I want to hear what you guys think about this type of stuff. What do you think about the Hadza people as they compare to us, and the way they eat and how often they eat, and the type of the activity levels, all that type of stuff? What does it motivate you to want to do for your own health? All right. That's it. Always remember, your doctor's not responsible for your health. You are. God bless you.